The Revolutionary War started as a colonial rebellion against the British on the fringes of its empire. It ended with an independent America and the idea of liberty spreading across the globe. All this happened because the rebels won the major battles. We're here to dive deep into each of them. Welcome to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast, hosted by James Early and Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series, Key Battles in the Revolutionary War. In the last episode, we saw that the British were able to hold on to Rhode Island, and the war is going to enter a period of stalemate. But we're going to step out of the North and Central colonies, and we're going to shift south in this sidetrack episode to look at how the war shifts south. So, take us through the background, James. Why do things change from focus from north to south in the war?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, the war in the North just really hadn't gone anywhere. The British can't seem to achieve that major victory, that elimination of Washington and his army. The public is very, in general, it's not so much in New York and parts of the middle colonies, but definitely New England. The public is definitely on the side of the Continental Army. They're definitely anti-British, pro-independence, pro-American. It was perceived that things were different in the South. Here's a quote from Lord George Germain, the British secretary responsible for the war. We've mentioned him before. He wrote to Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton, and he said, capturing the southern colonies was, quote, considered by the king as an object of great importance in the scale of the war. So, Germain and the king believed that the majority of the southern colonists were loyalists, and that if the British army could take key parts of the South, loyalists would rise up to join the British, and at the very least, the southern colonies could be brought back into the empire. So it's kind of like, things aren't working in the North, let's try the South. Maybe things will be better, maybe the people will rally to our cause, or at least a lot of them will, and let's give it a try. It's worth a try. So they're going to do that. They're going to shift their focus to the South. The Continentals or the Americans, Patriots, whatever you want to call them, they knew this was coming. So in September 1778, the Continental Congress appointed General Benjamin Lincoln as the commander of Continental forces in the South. In November of that year, the British forces conducted several raids into Georgia. And then the next month, a force of about 3,000 British regulars under Archibald Campbell arrived and captured Savannah, a major seaport, on December 29th. So Savannah falls to the British, a big blow to the Americans. They also took Augusta a month later, but they soon withdrew due to the presence of American forces nearby. Many Georgians took oaths of loyalty to the crown.
Yeah, this is where divisions get really sharp between Tories and Patriots. And the Revolutionary War, in a lot of ways, it resembles the divisions that happen at the end of the Civil War. A lot of the Civil War, you don't really see a lot of raiding and pillaging happening. But once you get to the end, for example, with Sherman's March to the Sea, that's where it becomes a war of destruction. And that's more for tactical reasons, not because there's a need for supplies or for foraging. But a lot of the bad feelings from the Civil War, which in many cases fester to today, come from that pillaging that happens in Sherman's March to the Sea. With Tories and Patriots, you have these retaliatory attacks happening that almost looks like jayhawkers and bushwhackers before the Civil War, where Patriot militias raid Tory towns and farms, and Tories retaliate by burning Patriot farms and hanging Patriots as traitors. So what happens is, if your farm is burned, if everything you have is pillaged, then a family would show up at a neighbor's door absolutely destitute and without a breadwinner if the breadwinner is hung. One case of this is Andrew Jackson. He became an orphan at the age of 14, and he was the only member of his family to survive the war. He was actually taken into captivity by the British. If someone left his farm to join either as a Patriot or a Tory militia, there's a good chance he'd be killed, his farm burned down, and the survivors in his family would be thrown onto the charity of kinfolk, if there were any left. If he tried to remain neutral, well, it was really hard at this time, any more than the Civil War later. So the idea is that if you're not with us, you're against us. And there were advantages at certain times of being a Tory, because if a Tory were forced to flee their home, they could go inside British lines or request assistance from the British Army. They couldn't always supply it, but you wouldn't have any such assistance from the Patriots when they couldn't really pay their own troops and barely feed them. One example of British cruelty that's dealt out by Lord Cornwallis to militia leader Andrew Pickens and his family. He wrote General John Kruger in command that if Colonel Pickens has left any Negroes, cattle, or other property that may be useful to supply the troops, I would have it seized accordingly, and I desire that his house may be burned and his plantations, as far as lies in your power, totally destroyed, and himself, if ever taken, instantly hanged. Major James Dunlap, who's assigned to this task, immediately led a detachment to Pickens' plantation, turned his wife and children out of the house into the cold with nothing but the clothes they were wearing, took all the food, cattle, and other supplies, and burned the house and all other structures. Dunlap then departed, leaving Rebecca Pickens and her children standing in the middle of the desolation, and they had to brave the January cold without any means of survival. So this is what's happening, and this is where divisions get pretty sharp between the two sides.
All right, now we're going to move to Charleston, South Carolina, a very even more significant city and port than Savannah. Lincoln arrived in Charleston. Benjamin Lincoln, that we mentioned earlier, the new commander of the American forces in the South. He arrives there in Charleston in January of 1779 to take charge of the city's defensive. He knew Charleston would be the next British target. In September 1779, Lincoln led a joint French-American attempt to retake Savannah. He laid siege to the city for a year, after which the Americans unsuccessfully attacked the city directly. The attempt was then abandoned with many casualties, including the Polish nobleman Casimir Pulaski, who we mentioned previously. So Pulaski is tragically killed in this really kind of a foolhardy attempt to take Savannah. Back to Charleston, in February of 1780, a force of about 14,000 British and Hessians under the personal command of Henry Clinton arrived, and they attacked Charleston. Remember, Clinton is the overall British commander of all British forces in North America. His base was in New York, but he himself wanted to come down and personally direct this attack on Charleston. He landed his troops on Simmons Island, southwest of the city, and marched them northeast to James Island, where he set up artillery. And from there, the British could bombard the city. In March, Clinton crossed the Ashley River and approached the edge of the city. At the same time, the Royal Navy sailed into the harbor. And on May 11th, Lincoln had no choice but to surrender the city and 7,000 defenders. This was a huge morale killer for the Americans. 7,000 soldiers, a big chunk of the American forces at the time, gone, as is the city of Charleston. So they've lost Savannah and they've lost Charleston. What are they going to lose next? It's not looking good, Scott.
No, it is not. So what else is happening in South Carolina? Are they able to push back against the tide, or does it keep coming in?
Not so much initially. The British continue into the hinterland of South Carolina. They occupy key cities such as Camden and the big whopping metropolis of 96. That is the name of a town, really not a city, but Rocky Mount and others. By May, 15,000 Loyalists had joined to fight with the British. So they saw where their bread was being buttered. These guys are, I'm not saying they were purely cynical. I'm sure they really did feel a loyalty to the crown and to the British government. But when the British show up, okay, now we're going to join up and fight. So they're taking advantage of the situation. Some of these later will actually become loyal Americans, but for now, they're fighting with the British. On May 29th, a force of British dragoons under Bannister Tarleton. I believe this is the first time that we've introduced Mr. Tarleton. He is actually, I think we've talked about him before, haven't we, Scott? I remember we talked about Bloody Ben was his nickname.
Yeah, is he the basis for the antagonist in The Patriot?
He is. Yeah, he's the character that the bad guy in The Patriot is modeled after. We've been recording so long, Scott, I can't remember exactly who we've talked about. But anyway, here he is. And he's going to stay in our story for quite some time now. Bannister Tarleton was a dragoon commander. And the story, at least according to most sources, they massacred an American unit at the town or the village of Waxhaw. Tarleton's his force killed many patriots after they had surrendered. So again, supposedly the story is that the Americans surrendered and Tarleton ordered them killed. By the way, the character in The Patriot is called Tavington. And one of the knocks against the movie The Patriot is it's too anti-British. It portrays the British as too cruel. To be fair, the British probably never burned down a church that was locked and had
women and children. Yeah.
Women and children. Yeah, that's ridiculous. That's excessive. But they weren't exactly super nice guys either. We've already seen several examples of British forces burning, pillaging, killing civilians. So I don't want our listeners to think that the British were this really civilized force that always respected the rights of civilians and never did anything wrong. They did. I mean, both sides committed atrocities. That's true in pretty much every war. But I think the Patriot, I'm going to be controversial here. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think the Patriot gets the big picture right. And that big picture is that the war in the South was especially brutal. It was especially harsh. As you mentioned before, it was, we've touched upon the fact that there were a lot of Americans fighting on the British side. There were loyalists. So it was very much a civil war in the South, more so than in the North. I mean, it was to some extent in the North as well, but certainly here in the South. All right. So, by the way, this idea of just not taking prisoners, of killing your prisoners after they surrender, became known as Tarleton's Quarter. And the Americans are going to respond in kind before long there. And I probably shouldn't use the term Americans here because the Loyalists were also Americans. They were just Americans that fought for the British. So maybe I should go back to Patriots.
Yeah, Loyalist and Patriot. There we go.
Yeah. General Clinton wrote Sir George Germain. He said, "I am sanguine enough to expect the recovery of the whole of the southern provinces in the course of the campaign." So very optimistic there. In June, he returned to New York City, and he left command of the British forces in the South to General Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis will remain the head honcho of the British forces in the South for the remainder of the war. Congress, meanwhile, they appoint a replacement for Benjamin Lincoln. We've seen that Lincoln was captured, or he was taken prisoner along with the 7,000 defenders of Charleston. And guess who they appoint to replace Benjamin Lincoln as the American commander, or the Patriot American commander in the South?
Well, I'd probably say someone very confident who's had an incredible track record of success. That's my guess. Am I right?
Yeah. Washington wanted Nathaniel Greene, but Congress said, nope, we're going to bring you Horatio Gates instead.
Wow.
Now, yeah, Gates, we have to be fair to Congress. Gates was seen as the hero of Saratoga. He was seen as the man who captured Burgoyne and his army, and that was certainly true, although a lot of the credit should go to Benedict Arnold, and it didn't. So Gates marches south, or I should say rides south. As soon as he arrives, he decides to go on the offensive, even though his army had eaten very little over the last several days. Gates marched toward Camden, South Carolina. Cornwallis marched north to meet him, and near Camden, Cornwallis attacked. The North Carolina militia dropped their muskets and fled. That's something militia have a tendency to do sometimes. The British overwhelmed the remaining Americans under a commander named DeKalb. 50% of the American force became casualties. 50%. Wow. That is huge. Half the army gone. And out of that, 1,100 are captured. Only 20% of the British force became casualties. So this is called the Battle of Camden. Here we're sneaking in another battle real quick prior to our key battles that we'll talk about a little bit later. But absolute disaster for the Americans. And not only did the American force lose half of their people, they also lose their commander. General Gates gets on a horse. He flies the battlefield. He flies from the battlefield, I should say. He gets on his horse. He gallops north as fast as he can, and he rides northward for 180 miles before stopping. I love to tell this story to my students. They always go, what?
That's incredible endurance. That's Mongol time right there of how far you get on horseback.
Yeah, you got to give him points. Give him points for that. But if you're the head honcho of the army, you don't leave your army behind. You stay with them. Needless to say, Gates was soon relieved of command, and he became the laughing stock of the American army. Later, he was brought before a congressional inquiry, but he was exonerated.
Okay.
Interestingly enough. Sure, yeah, he had his reasons for fleeing, for going almost 200 miles away from his army. Anyway, despite this, most of the loyalists in the area did not provide much help to the British. They often deserted and sometimes fought each other. So loyalists were not even a unified body. There were different factions within the loyalists, and sometimes they fought each other more than they fought the Patriots. Also, South Carolina guerrilla units led by Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter harassed British forces all over the state. And I'd love to spend more time on this, but we just really don't have the time to go into a lot of detail. There's a great book on Francis Marion called The Swamp Fox. And Marion and Sumter and their forces, they would hide out, sometimes literally in swamps, and then the British would be marching along, and the Swamp Fox and his small army, or Sumter, or both, would just appear out of nowhere seemingly and just pick them off from the woods, or just stop right in front of them and shoot down the British, ambush them. So they caused a lot of grief to Cornwallis and to Tarleton and the other British commanders. And yes, Mel Gibson's character in The Patriot is loosely based on these guys. He's kind of a composite character. He's kind of Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter all rolled up into one. They called him the Ghost in the movie, whereas in real life, Marion was called the Swamp Fox. But we owe a lot, or Americans owe a lot, to these men who, if they were going to be captured, they would be hung probably. But they really made life very, very difficult for the British, and were a large part of why the British were not able to carry out their plan of conquering the South. One more thing real quick. As we kind of touched upon, a virtual state of civil war existed in the South. You have British and Loyalists fighting Americans, Patriot Americans. You also have Americans fighting Americans, and sometimes Loyalists are fighting among themselves. So, and alliances would shift. People would change sides from time to time. British and Loyalist forces engaged in rape, pillaging, and burning churches, especially Presbyterian ones. They like to pick on the Presbyterian churches, I guess because they weren't Church of England. So yes, the British did engage in rape. They did pillage. They stole. They burned churches. Just probably not churches with people in them. At least we don't have any. We don't have any examples of that handed down for history's sake.
Tarleton has his limits, but this is a change in focus of the war, where what Tarleton does and what Tory and Loyalist units do, they are maybe trying to cause fear, but it seems like it causes more rage instead. And we've used the analogy many times in the series of the British being caught between having to use the carrot and the stick, where early on it's more of the carrot, with the Howe brothers being softer and more reserved and how hard they go out. Cornwallis and others, Tarleton especially, are using the stick. And their Tory units, in the way that they're structured, can be harsher than Patriot units possibly can, especially in the South. There are Tory units that come from the North, and there are also, like we mentioned earlier, Scots and Irish Catholics, and this fuels a long-standing Southern hatred of Northerners and Scots and Irish Catholics for these brutal actions. And there's also animosity against the Cherokee, because they're used by the British as well. And some think that this informs Andrew Jackson's decision to launch the Trail of Tears, because when he had the opportunity to drive them beyond the Mississippi, he takes it with relish, remembering his boyhood and those that were attacked by them.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
I'm Scott from the History Unplugged podcast. History can be a bit of a tongue twister with its weird-sounding names of people, places, and things, but it really isn't that confusing. History is the story of who we are and how we comport ourselves while soaring to victory in battles over forts, seaports, and cities that fortunately thwarted the schemes of villains and their blood sports, like the 1415 Battle of Agincourt. It's about legal battles in courts, about the contortion of torts over the retorts of consorts that turned into kangaroo courts. I exhort you to listen to History Unplugged on the podcast player of your choice, and you can listen to it while wearing shirts, shorts, skirts, skirts, or jean jorts. So what happens here is that there's some protection for Tory families in the fact that British raise Tory units in the North and send them to the South. If a soldier is too harsh, if they're raping and pillaging, then their misdeeds don't bring retribution on their family. if they live in British zones in the North. So Tory troops from New York, New Jersey could murder Southern patriots and mistreat their wives and children, but there's not as many instances of Continental troops from Virginia or Maryland abusing Tory families. And, you'd like to say they're more high-minded, but then there's also reprisal or retribution if you're doing this somewhat close to your own community. And Patriot militia in the South do execute captured Tories who are known for brutality to Patriot families. So the war is heating up, is my point.
Yeah, I don't want to leave the impression that the Americans were completely innocent or the Patriots were innocent of any atrocities. They certainly did retaliate in kind once in a while. So it was brutal. The rules were, the rule book was thrown away, I guess, for this part of the war.
All right. Well, I think we should look at a very interesting chapter, a conspicuous chapter in the Revolutionary War. So let's talk about someone who was a hero and becomes something quite different.
Yes, we're going to shift gears now. We're going to leave the war in the South behind for a little bit, and we are going to finally close the book kind of more or less on Benedict Arnold, or at least officially talk about what happened in the end of Benedict Arnold. So we've seen Arnold has been at the forefront of the action in many battles. He keeps popping up all over the place. He helped take Fort Ticonderoga very early in the war in 1775. He led or co-led the failed attack on Quebec in late 1775, early 76. We saw him at Rhode Island. We saw him at Saratoga. So he had done a lot. Valcour Island, we mentioned that. He was the hero of Valcour Island. So he had served his country very boldly. He had served with excellence for the most part, despite his personal flaws. He spent a lot of his own money and didn't get reimbursed, at least not completely, by Congress. So he felt all along that he was mistreated by Congress and many of his commanders, especially Horatio Gates, who downplayed his role in helping win the Battle of Saratoga. If you remember the story, Gates had actually ordered Benedict Arnold. He ordered Arnold to not participate in the battle, at least the second day on Bemis Heights, but Arnold did anyway, disobeyed orders, and we're glad he did because he helped rally the troops, helped lead the Americans to victory. But another side of Benedict Arnold is that he loved a lavish lifestyle. He, like many people of the time, and many people today, in fact, he liked to spend more than he could afford to spend. And as a result, he was deeply in debt. In June of 1778, Washington appointed Arnold as military commander of Philadelphia. The Americans had just retaken Philadelphia. Remember, we talked about how Clinton and the British left. Arnold's leg was seriously injured. He had one leg that was shorter than the other, and he was limited on what he could do. Washington felt this would be a good place to put Arnold. He'll be essentially the mayor of the town. He'll be the military commander of the town. He won't have to ride a horse and be involved in battles. But it turns out to not be a great idea. This turned out to be a mistake. Washington could not have foreseen this. But there in Philadelphia, Arnold fell in love with and married a young lady, way younger than him, by the way, named Peggy Shippen. And she had strong Loyalist leanings, as did her father. And there in Philadelphia, Arnold seems to have used his position to enrich himself. He was there was just some shady business dealings, things where he was using Continental Army resources to enrich himself and to bring profit. He was brought before a court-martial in 1779, but the court-martial cleared him of all but two minor charges in 1780. Nevertheless, Washington formally rebuked him. He had to at least say, well, we don't like what you did, even though Washington previously had done everything he could to be very supportive of Arnold. Arnold was not easy to deal with. By the end of 1779, Arnold had enough. He was just tired of the Patriot cause. He felt underappreciated, and probably his new young wife was whispering in his ear. So by the end of 1779, Arnold had begun secret negotiations with the British to surrender the American fort at West Point New York. West Point at the time was not the military academy. That would be later. West Point was a significant fort on the Hudson River. And it just so happened that Washington had made Arnold the commander of the fort. He just appointed him there. Arnold really didn't like Philadelphia that much. I mean, he liked Philadelphia. He loved the town, but he wanted something that was, I don't know, more prestigious, more like a real military command. So Arnold agreed to give up the fort to the British in return for money and a command in the British Army. His chief intermediary was British Major John Andre, who was a young man at the time. He was about 30 years old. Andre was the head of the British Spy Corps or the spy efforts. They didn't really have a formal corps. Andre was captured in September of 1780, while crossing between British and American lines. He was disguised in civilian clothes. And the people that caught him found on Andre some papers. They were actually inside of his sock. I imagine they didn't smell very good, but we'll overlook that because they were complete plans to the West Point fort going toward the British. They incriminated Arnold in treason, and Arnold learned about Andre's capture and what had happened, so he fled to British lines before the Patriots could arrest him. This is a great story, by the way, and we are not doing it justice. We could do a whole episode on this.
Oh, yeah.
You probably should sometime, Scott. That would be a great episode.
Good idea.
There's so many cool details. They just missed Arnold. Washington was scheduled to have breakfast with him, and Arnold gave him the slip. And Washington sitting around, okay, where is he? Where is he? We're sorry, he's late. And then later Washington found out about his treachery and was, needless to say, not happy about it. So Arnold gets away, but West Point does not go into British hands. It remains in American hands, and Arnold only received a portion of his promised bounty. And the Americans, meanwhile, they had caught Andre. They hanged him as a spy in October 1780. We remember how Nathan Hale had been hanged by the British. Well, turnabout is fair play. And it's kind of tragic because John Andre was a real romantic figure. He was an artist. He was a playwright. He was a bon vivant, a very talented man, a man of many talents. But Washington had enough of people that he wanted to get Arnold. He wanted to punish Arnold, but he couldn't punish Arnold because Arnold got away. So Andre's the next best thing. News of Arnold's treachery re-energized many patriots' morale, which had sagged. So really tragic situation. Scott, you wanted to say a few things about it too.
Yeah, and the attempt to capture him leads to some very interesting stories, which we will talk about in a later episode, specifically on espionage and spycraft. So we're not quite done with Arnold, and in our final episode, we'll see what happens to these different people. But this really got my wheels turning when I thought about Benedict Arnold in American history and how we look at history in general. He is a byword for a traitor. You can know nothing about him, but everyone recognizes the name Benedict Arnold. And just as you were talking, James, when I thought about the term Benedict Arnold in popular media, what came to my mind was, I think, Revenge of the Nerds 3, where the head nerd, Louis Skolnick, goes over to the cool people, and another nerd says to him, "You are the Abraham Lincoln of nerds, and now you've become the Benedict Arnold." And so there you go. That's my phrase. But he's universally seen as a traitor. That's clear. But there are arguments that other people in history could be traitors, but we don't see them as traitors. And I want to delve into what makes him unequivocally a traitor. So, for example, in the Revolutionary War, the British are constantly calling the Patriots traitors or rebels. That's the term that they use, rebels. George Washington, I'm sure many British thought of him as a traitor. You have served the British Empire valiantly in the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. Now you are threatening to tear it apart. You're allying with the French, the enemy of the British for centuries and centuries and centuries. You are insulting the dignity of God's appointed monarch, the king. You are defying the will of the Almighty by your actions. You are a traitor, every bit as treacherous, every bit as steeped in sin against morality as Benedict Arnold. I'm speaking from the point of the British, perhaps some thought against George Washington.
Hey everyone, Scott here. one more brief word from our sponsors.
I'm Scott from the History Unplugged podcast. History can be a bit of a tongue twister with its weird-sounding names of people, places, and things, but it really isn't that confusing. History is the story of who we are and how we comport ourselves while soaring to victory in battles over forts, seaports, and cities that fortunately thwarted the schemes of villains and their blood sports, like the 1415 Battle of Agincourt. It's about legal battles in courts, about the contortion of torts over the retorts of consorts that turned into kangaroo courts. I exhort you to listen to History Unplugged on the podcast player of your choice, and you can listen to it while wearing shirts, shorts, skirts, skirts, or jean jorts. In the Civil War series, at the end, when James and I were talking about that and the legacy of the Civil War, there is still a lot of argument about how we understand the South and how do we look at the Confederate flag as it hangs today. Yes, listeners, I know it wasn't the Confederate flag. It was the flag for the Army of Northern Virginia, but just bear with me. The most generous take I've seen on the South is that Southern aficionados and apologists will say that let all Americans embrace Southern history. Let them embrace Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, because they're not just Southern heroes, they're American heroes because they imbibe the spirit of defending your homeland and the true rights of the Constitution. I'm not going to get into all that, but they see, well, the Southerners weren't traitors, but those who are against the South would say they broke away from the Union. They are Benedict Arnold. They are traitors. But even people who don't like the Confederacy wouldn't put a Robert E. Lee into the same camp as a Benedict Arnold. And I have a couple thoughts, but I don't know. I'm not quite sure on where I land on this. So what do you think, James? Like, what makes Arnold do you think there's an argument to be made that, well, he has just been misunderstood by history and Washington could be seen as a traitor based on your perspective? Or is there something qualitatively different about Arnold?
I don't think so necessarily. I think whether somebody's a traitor or not depends on what side you're on.
Yeah.
I mean, the British would have definitely said that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Franklin and all those guys, they're all traitors. And had they been caught, they most certainly would have been hung. We look at Arnold as a traitor because he tried to sell us down the river. He tried to give away a major fort to the British. He took money. He took a commission in the British Army. So I just think it depends on what side you're on, really.
Yeah, I don't know if there's an argument that he did it for money, for greed, so that makes him a Judas Iscariot, and Dante's vision of hell, the three people being chewed by Satan for all eternity, are traitors. Judas Iscariot, Brutus, and who's the third one? But some other Roman. Cassius?
Yeah, not a big Dante aficionado, sorry.
Well, anyway, that's so had Dante written in the 18th century, maybe he would have given Satan a fourth mouth to chew up Benedict Arnold. Maybe he'd have a better standing in history if he had done it for loyalist pure motives and not baser motives of pay. But I think you had mentioned off microphone one time, James, that there was a historian, you had read an account where they tried to rehabilitate Benedict Arnold as much as possible, saying that it was for nobler causes. Do I have that right?
Yeah, there was. It was done on the podcast Ben Franklin's World.
Okay. What was the argument? Do you remember?
Arnold himself made the argument that he felt like he was doing what was best for his country. That was the main argument. Arnold felt that the patriot cause was not best representing the wishes of the average people. I don't know if that's. I don't think that's correct. I think he was trying to justify himself. And I mean, there were certainly, obviously, as we've said many times, there were many people in America that were loyal to Britain, and they wanted to stay part of the British Empire. So he was definitely representing what they wanted, but they were definitely in the minority, and increasingly so as the war progressed. Let me say one other thing, too. Maybe what makes Arnold different, and I'm just completely going off the cuff here, but if you think about people like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, they were primarily loyal to their state. I'm actually, even as we are recording this, over the last couple of weeks, I've been listening to a audiobook, which is a biography of Robert E. Lee, a recent one that came out. And Lee did not like secession. He was not in favor of it. He wanted to stay part of the Union Army. He had served the United States for 32 years as an Army officer, way longer than he would for the Confederacy. He did not want to leave the U.S. Army or the Union, but his state did, and his first loyalty was to Virginia, not to the United States as a nation. I think George Washington probably felt the same way. He would have liked to have been part of Britain. I remember he tried to be in the British Army for years and years. He wanted to get a commission, but I think Washington felt like he had no choice but to leave because of British tyranny. Arnold, I don't know that he had that motivation. I don't know that he ever said, oh, gee, I really hate to do this, but I've got to go with my state or my home. My home, Washington and Lee were both loyal to Virginia. Benedict Arnold was from Connecticut, and Connecticut was one of the most radical states that was out there. Connecticut was 100% pretty much in the Patriot camp, or close to 100%. So Benedict Arnold did not change sides out of loyalty for his homeland, his home state. He went against his homeland. So I don't know, maybe that makes him different. I'm just thinking out loud. What do you think?
It's hard to say, because if we wanted to dog on Jefferson or Washington, we could also say they did what they did for financial interest, like Arnold, and I'm taking the most pessimistic view possible.
Yeah, there's no doubt that was a factor.
They were landholders, and they wanted to expand, which King George did not allow to appease Native American groups there. Their financial interests were hurt, and that is part of the reason, not to denigrate Jefferson or Washington too much. And with Arnold, I don't know. It's difficult because I think my tendency is, when I look at historical figures, especially those who are from a different time and do things that would insult the sensibilities of the modern era, I try to err on the side of giving them the benefit of the doubt. I think even Plutarch wrote about this in the Lives of the Roman Emperors, to consider historical figures, to see them as the composite of their positive qualities, and think of negative qualities as the context of the times, because if you only judge them by the present day, then you're going to essentially deconstruct them and not look at them in all their complexity, but turn them into stock villains in order to support your own contemporary cause. And I think that's a very powerful quote by Plutarch, and something that, as we're radically reassessing historical figures, and as Thomas Jefferson's hometown is trying to get rid of Thomas Jefferson today because he owned slaves, and completely disregard every positive thing he has done since then, I think could do an enormous damage on history and how we understand the past. So with Benedict Arnold, if we truly do give him the benefit of the doubt that he thought he was doing the best, it's something to think about. And keep in mind, many of the people in the colonies, those who are loyalists, you could argue that they, as understanding their duties as a religious person, would look at scripture that tell you to all authority is God ordained, and their scripture that they're reading was written for Christians under the Roman Empire, which was infinitely more brutal than the British Empire at the time. So they would think, were Christians in the first century expected to be loyal to the Roman Empire, how much more should we be loyal to the British Empire? And a monarch is something that is ordained by God, so we are in mortal sin by defying this. So they would see the patriots as radical and doing something that is ultimately detrimental to their faith. So there's a lot of different angles you could see this, and it's a complex thing. You can say that Arnold was doing it out of base motives. You could say that he was doing it out of higher motives, but I don't know. Humans are complex, and they contain multitudes. It could be both.
Absolutely. I agree with everything you said.
Yeah, hard to say. All right, well, that was what we looked at in our sidetrack episode. So we're going to shift back to our key battles. And this might be a first, James. We're actually going to handle 2 battles in one episode, if you can believe such a thing. Usually it's 2 episodes per battle. But these battles are a little bit smaller. And as you see, if you take a look at our maps we provide, they're pretty straightforward. We're not going to look at any sophisticated, complex flanking maneuvers. So we're going to look at Kings Mountain in the next episode, and then we're going to follow up immediately with Cowpens. Thanks for listening to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast. If you'd like more info, go to keybattlesoftherevolutionarywar.com, where you'll find show notes, maps, and other resources that we talk about in these episodes. And if you like the show, please rate and review us on the podcast player of your choice. It helps us grow the show and reach new listeners. Until next time, my friends, grab your tankard of ale or glass of Madeira and raise a toast to liberty.